When I saw him spill coffee on her blouse and smirk like it was funny, something inside me snapped. It was just another ordinary morning. Or at least that's what I told myself as I stood by the kitchen counter, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. The smell of burnt toast hung faintly in the air, mingling with the faint, almost imperceptible scent of her perfume, my twin sister's perfume, clinging stubbornly to the living room curtains. I could hear the soft patter of rain against the window, a rhythm that usually calmed me, but today it only amplified the tension coiling inside me. I glanced at the clock. 7:42 a.m. Our lives had become a carefully scripted routine: get up, make breakfast, check emails, make small talk, and somehow survive the unspoken dramas that lingered like dust in the corners. My twin, Layla, had been married to Ethan for 4 years. From the outside, they were the perfect couple: polite smiles, shared dinners, a house that smelled like vanilla and lavender. But the truth I was slowly discovering was far less pristine. I reached for my mug again, shaking slightly. My hands were never usually this jittery in the mornings. Maybe it was the way I had watched him last night, standing too close to Lila at her birthday dinner, his hand brushing hers in a gesture that was anything but innocent. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into it. But my instincts rarely lied. Growing up, Lila and I were inseparable. We shared secrets, clothes, even our bedrooms until we were 16. I knew her moods better than anyone, could tell the difference between a sad sigh and a melancholic thought before she even spoke. But ever since she married Ethan, she had begun to change. She laughed less freely, her eyes sometimes holding shadows I had never seen before. She came over less often, her phone glued to her hand, always responding to texts with attention I recognized instantly. I remembered the first subtle clue, almost a month ago. Lila had confided in me that Ethan had laughed at her when she suggested they hire a cleaner for the house. Not because he thought it was unnecessary, but because he enjoyed watching her struggle with it, enjoying her discomfort. I brushed it off, telling her not to worry, that marriages had their quirks. But deep down, I felt the first prick of worry, that unease that never quite leaves you when you see someone you love being quietly belittled. That morning, I decided I would check on her, really check. I drove through the drizzle to her house, my windshield wipers slicing rhythmically through the mist. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. Her hair was pinned messily, her blouse stained where Ethan had knocked over the coffee cup, and she was holding a trembling hand to her chest like she'd just survived a storm. "Hey," I said softly, stepping inside, feeling the heat from the radiator brush my cold fingers. "Are you okay?" She laughed, but it was hollow, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes. "I'm fine," she whispered, but the tremor betrayed her. I wanted to wrap my arms around her, to tell her it would be okay, but I hesitated. Because I knew, in that instant, that fine was just a mask. And behind that mask was a story I wasn't sure I was ready to hear yet. I looked around the living room. The cushions were slightly askew, the coffee table littered with cups and papers, and a faint smell of burnt toast lingered from a breakfast that no one seemed to enjoy. Ethan's jacket was slumped over the armchair, almost as if it were watching us, a silent reminder of his presence even when he wasn't there. I wanted to scream at him, to tear him apart for making her feel so small, so unseen. But instead, I sat beside her and took her hand. And that's when she whispered, barely audible, "I can't do this anymore. I don't think I can stay." Something in me shifted. I wasn't going to just sit back and watch my sister crumble. Not this time. Not ever. And that was the moment the plan began to form in my mind, reckless and dangerous, but fueled by a love only a twin could feel. We would switch places. We would step into each other's shoes, and I would make sure Ethan understood, in ways he couldn't ignore, that he had crossed a line he shouldn't have. Little did I know, the storm we were about to unleash would change all of us as forever. The next morning, I stood in Lila's bedroom, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror. Her face looked back at me, familiar, yet strangely fragile. I touched my cheek where her blush usually sat, trying to mimic the softness of her expression. I had always thought I knew her, but now I had to be her. Every gesture, every hesitation, every laugh needed to be hers. She watched me from the doorway, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Her voice trembled, betraying how desperate she felt. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said, gripping her hand. "He won't know the difference, not at first. But he will feel the consequences." We planned every detail meticulously. Lila would disappear for a few days under the pretext of a work trip. I would step into her life, carefully observing, listening, and most importantly, paying attention to the cracks Ethan had been exploiting. On my first morning in her skin, I walked into the kitchen wearing her favorite blouse, the one she always reserved for important meetings, or in this case, for surviving breakfast with Ethan. I could hear him in the living room, humming a tune he thought I wouldn't notice. I stepped lightly, testing the waters, my nerves buzzing like static electricity. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said as I entered. His tone was casual, smooth, like always, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach twist. "Coffee's on the counter. I figured you'd need it before tackling the emails." I smiled, but it wasn't just any smile. It was her smile, polite, disarming, sweet enough to make him believe nothing had changed. I poured a cup and took it to the table, letting the steam warm my hands. Every detail mattered, the way she wrapped her fingers around the mug, the subtle tilt of her head, the way she hummed when she was slightly amused. He watched me for a moment too long. I caught that slight smirk he often wore when he thought he was charming, but today, I let it hang there without returning it. I didn't laugh, didn't flirt, didn't feed into his small power plays. That tiny hesitation, he didn't notice it, but it planted the first seed of discomfort. Over the next few days, I observed everything. I watched the way he criticized her cooking under the guise of joking. I noticed the way he dismissed her ideas during discussions, even about things as trivial as which curtains to buy. I felt the subtle bruises he left on her confidence, the invisible marks that went unnoticed by everyone else. And then I began the small interventions. First, I asked questions that made him pause, simple things about his schedule or his day, phrased in ways that subtly exposed contradictions in his stories. Then I gently highlighted her accomplishments, forcing him to acknowledge them out loud. Small, deliberate actions that seemed innocent, but each one unsettled him more than he could understand. The hardest part was holding my tongue when he leaned into his usual charm, expecting compliance or flattery. I didn't give him either. I didn't yell, I didn't retaliate overtly. I just existed in that space, mirroring her life perfectly, while letting the tension build quietly. Every minor rebellion, every carefully worded disagreement, made him question something he had always taken for granted: control. And all the while, I saw Lila through my eyes, the bruised but unbroken version of herself, the twin I had always known needed a voice. Seeing her so vulnerable had been painful, but stepping into her shoes allowed me to plan, to act with precision, and to give her something she had longed for, the quiet justice of being seen and respected. By the end of the third day, Ethan was already changing, small cracks forming in his confident facade. He still didn't know it was me, but he was starting to sense that the woman he thought he controlled was no longer the same. And that's when I realized the real game had just begun. This wasn't just about exposing him, it was about reclaiming her life, piece by piece, moment by moment. It was subtle at first, a glance he couldn't quite hide, a tension in his jaw when I asked a question that forced him to explain himself. Ethan had always assumed Lila would laugh off his jabs, excuse his impatience, or smooth over his little insults. But I wasn't Lila. I was the same blood, the same instincts, but without the weight of her resignation. That morning, I found him hovering near the kitchen counter, fiddling with his phone as if he'd forgotten why he'd entered the room. "Did you schedule the plumber for the leak in the bathroom?" I asked casually, setting my mug down with a deliberate, almost exaggerated clink. He looked up, surprised. I thought you'd handle that," he said, the words slipping out faster than he meant. His voice carried that familiar mix of irritation and disbelief, like a man realizing the rules he thought applied no longer did. "I can handle it," I said, my tone light but firm. "But you told me last week you'd take care of it. I just want to make sure we're on the same page." His eyes narrowed slightly. That was the first real sign I was getting under his skin. The careful politeness I'd been using, the imitation of Lila's softness, was enough to make him question his own assumptions. He was used to dominance, to subtle compliance. I offered neither. Later that day, I caught him alone in the living room, flipping through the TV channels with that smirk he always wore when he thought he was amusing. "I thought you liked that show," I said, casually leaning against the doorway, mimicking Lila's posture perfectly. "I do," he replied, a little too quickly. "Just didn't feel like it today." I didn't comment further. I just watched, noticing how his smirk faltered when he realized I wasn't going to engage in his usual banter. The silence stretched longer than usual, an uncomfortable gap that left him fidgeting with the remote. By the fourth day, the small inconsistencies in his behavior became impossible to ignore. He started double-checking what he said, hesitating before he spoke, like he had begun suspecting something was off. Each small victory felt like a spark of empowerment, not just for Lila, but for me, too. And yet, it wasn't all strategy. There were moments when stepping into her shoes felt unbearably heavy. I found her journal tucked beneath her bedside table, and reading her private thoughts was like stepping into a storm I hadn't anticipated. Lines about feeling trapped, about hiding her fear behind smiles, about wishing someone would notice the quiet bruises on her spirit. I closed it quickly, my throat tight, but the words fueled me further. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about giving her the freedom she'd been denied. That evening, Ethan tried his usual manipulation, small compliments masked as jokes, light touches meant to unsettle, but I met each one with calm indifference. At dinner, when he spilled the wine on the tablecloth intentionally, expecting her to jump or apologize, I simply sighed and said, "Careful, that's our favorite set." He froze. His hand trembled slightly as he set the bottle down. He hadn't anticipated a response that didn't bend under his expectations. The tension hung thick in the air, charged and uncomfortable, but satisfying in a way that made my chest tighten with both anger and relief. It was then, as he muttered an apology that barely left his lips, that I realized just how effective the switch was. He wasn't noticing the trick. I wasn't trying to expose myself yet, but he was beginning to understand that the person he thought he dominated was no longer compliant. I could see it in the small things, the way he straightened his posture when I entered the room, the way he hesitated before speaking, the subtle edge in his voice that hinted at frustration. And the more I observed, the more I understood just how far he had taken his control over Lila, and how much he would have to reckon with it, once the full plan unfolded. By the end of the evening, a quiet storm was settling over the house. Ethan was unsettled, tense, and unbalanced, and I could feel the tide beginning to turn. The real work, the slow, meticulous unraveling of his arrogance, was just beginning. It happened the next morning. A text arrived on Lila's phone, Ethan's account, but the words were cold, calculated, sharp. "We need to talk. Now." I felt a jolt run through me, not because I feared him, but because I knew what was coming. He thought he had control, but the moment had shifted. I didn't reply immediately. I sipped my tea, watching the steam curl toward the ceiling, and rehearsed my words. Every conversation with him from now on would be deliberate, every pause, every emphasis carefully chosen to make him face the consequences of his behavior. He was waiting in the living room when I stepped in, hands clasped behind his back, a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "We need to talk," he said, voice low, but the words carried a weight that made my stomach clench. "About?" I asked, leaning against the doorway casually, the same soft posture Lila used when she was genuinely curious but cautious. "You know what I mean," he snapped, then paused, as if he realized he shouldn't have raised his voice. His eyes searched mine, or hers, in this case, but the hesitation was enough to make him uneasy. I walked slowly into the room, the sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood like tiny accusations. Do I? I asked, tilting my head slightly, letting my voice hover between curiosity and something sharper, something he wasn't used to seeing. What's going on? His hands shook slightly now, betraying the first true sign of panic. You've been different. I can't figure it out. Different? I echoed, letting the word linger in the air. Or maybe I'm finally starting to notice how things really are. He flinched. There it was, the subtle intake of breath that meant he realized his control was slipping. I sat down at the table, smoothing the tablecloth with deliberate care. You've made her life unbearable, I said softly. Little things. Tiny words. Little dismissals that add up. And you've thought she wouldn't notice. Or worse, that she'd forgive it without complaint. But that's not the case anymore. His eyes widened. What are you talking about? I'm talking about everything you've done, Ethan. Every sarcastic comment about her cooking, every belittling remark about her ideas, every moment you've enjoyed her discomfort because you could. Do you have any idea what that does to someone? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The calmness, the quiet fury beneath it, was enough. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I didn't realize. You did realize, I said gently, leaning forward. That's the worst part. You knew exactly what you were doing. And now, I'm here to make sure that she doesn't have to suffer in silence anymore. There was a long pause. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge, the distant patter of rain, and the shallow, rapid rhythm of his breathing. For the first time, he seemed genuinely small, like the facade of the confident, controlling husband had finally cracked. I don't know what to say, he muttered, almost to himself. You don't have to say anything, I said, standing, letting my shadow stretch across the floor. You just need to understand that this isn't about anger or revenge. It's about accountability. Every time you belittled her, every time you ignored her voice, you left a mark. And now, it's time you felt what that does. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, I saw fear, not fear of me personally, but the realization that his actions had consequences. That the quiet, unassuming woman he thought he controlled had been replaced by someone who would not bend, who would not flinch, who would finally make him understand. I left the room without another word, letting the tension hang, thick and suffocating. He would replay our conversation over and over in his mind, wondering how the woman he knew, or thought he knew, could suddenly feel so untouchable. And I knew, deep down, that the next days would force him to confront truths he had spent years ignoring. I could feel it in the way the air felt heavy, almost electric. The discovery had been made, and nothing would be the same again. Over the next few days, I watched Ethan stumble through our carefully constructed web of consequences. We hadn't planned a public spectacle. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about making him recognize the subtle ways he had controlled and hurt Lila. Every interaction, every small misstep, was designed to give him that realization. The first morning, I deliberately left the breakfast table slightly messy. Crumbs along the counter, a smudge of jam on a plate. Lila would have tidied it up before he even noticed, but I stayed silent. When he entered the kitchen, his eyes scanned the chaos, and I caught that familiar tightening in his jaw. "Didn't you clean up?" he asked, voice carefully neutral. "I did what I could," I replied in her voice, calm but deliberate. "But I guess sometimes things get missed." His frown lingered. That pause, that flicker of doubt, was exactly what I needed. Small, subtle discomforts, one after another, began to chip away at the shield of arrogance he had worn for years. Later that day, I attended a neighborhood gathering in Lila's place. Ethan followed, expecting me to be the quiet, polite wife who nodded and laughed at the right moments. But instead, I engaged him in front of friends and neighbors, subtly highlighting his failures without confrontation. When he tried to take credit for something he had done poorly, I gently corrected him, citing the real outcome. His smile faltered, and I could see the frustration building behind his eyes. Back at home, I started to push boundaries he had never dared challenge. Simple things at first, choosing the music in the house, rearranging furniture slightly, deciding on dinner without consulting him. Each action, small on its own, accumulated like pressure in a sealed vessel. And with every subtle act of autonomy, Ethan's irritation grew. By the 5th day, I realized we needed to escalate carefully. I left small notes around the house, reminders of his behavior, carefully phrased as questions rather than accusations. "Remember when you said she couldn't manage her own schedule?" one read, left by his briefcase. "Do you think she's surprised you didn't notice her efforts?" When he found the notes, I could almost see the panic settle in. For the first time, he questioned not just me, but himself. The arrogance that had shielded him for years was cracking. He tried to argue, to deflect, to charm, but none of it worked. Every manipulation met with calm, deliberate boundaries. One evening, I confronted him directly, but without anger. "Ethan," I said, sitting across from him at the dinner table, "I need you to understand something. This isn't about me being clever. This is about recognizing what you've done to someone who trusted you completely. It's about the small cruelties you've allowed to slide by, thinking they were harmless. They weren't. And now, they have consequences." He looked at me, really looked, and for the first time I saw remorse, or maybe fear, settle into his expression. I didn't realize it was like that," he whispered, voice breaking slightly. "You did," I replied softly, leaning forward, the weight of the calm fury in my words pressing against him. "You just didn't care enough to notice until someone made you. This is your chance to fix it. Start by being honest, with her, with yourself, with everyone you've hurt." That night, I left the room, letting him sit in silence, alone with the discomfort he had never faced before. And as I walked down the hallway, I realized just how effective our plan had been. It wasn't about exposing him in public, it wasn't about revenge, it was about teaching accountability. For the first time, I felt the faint stirrings of relief. Lila's life, even if only temporarily, was her own again. And Ethan, he was beginning to understand the weight of the life he had been careless with. It was slow, painstaking, and deeply satisfying. Every pause, every hesitance in his movements, every faltering word reminded me that justice didn't have to be loud to be effective. And in that quiet, deliberate dismantling of his arrogance, I felt something shift inside me too, the power of intervention, the strength of love, and the courage to step into someone else's world and fight for them when they couldn't. Word spreads faster than we anticipate in small circles, even when the intentions aren't loud or vindictive. By the end of the week, Ethan's behavior had become noticeable, not just to me, but to the people who interacted with him regularly. The subtle changes I orchestrated, small as they were, had begun to ripple outward. At Lila's book club meeting, I overheard a neighbor murmur, "He seems different lately. Quieter, like he's walking on eggshells." Another added, "I don't know what's happened, but she looks lighter, more at ease." A faint smile tugged at my lips. That was the point, the shift didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to be real. At home, Ethan's confusion grew. He kept second-guessing himself, wondering why his usual tactics, subtle intimidation, charm, the casual belittling of Lila, no longer worked. I could see him pacing in the living room one evening, muttering under his breath, finally confronting the truth of his actions. "Why are you different?" he asked, finally breaking his carefully constructed mask in my presence. I let out a soft sigh, the sound almost maternal, almost weary. "Because someone had to be," I said simply. "Someone had to make you realize what your words, your gestures, your little games were doing to her. And maybe now, just maybe, you'll start treating her differently, not because I told you to, but because you understand what it feels like when you're on the receiving end." He swallowed hard, the words lodging in his throat like a bitter pill he couldn't spit out. The realization was unmistakable in his eyes, the first spark of accountability. And the moment it struck him, I knew the public consequences were already in motion. By the next day, family and friends began noticing subtle changes too. When Lila appeared at gatherings, well, me, acting as her, people commented on her newfound confidence, the slight sparkle in her eyes. Ethan's dismissive comments faltered mid-sentence, and even casual acquaintances noticed the tension hovering around him. One evening, during a casual dinner with his colleagues, I noticed him hesitate when he reached for a bottle of wine, his hand hovering in indecision. A colleague raised an eyebrow, and I smiled faintly to myself, noticing the ripple of subtle social accountability. He wasn't being humiliated, but he was being seen. Every slight, every dismissive act he had relied upon for years now reflected back on him, magnified by the quiet power of observation and awareness. The turning point came when Lila, finally confident enough, decided to reclaim her voice. At a family gathering, she spoke directly about her feelings, softly but firmly addressing Ethan's behavior. The way she articulated her emotions, the courage in her voice, stunned him. He hadn't expected confrontation in public, and now the people who mattered, the family, friends, were witnessing her strength. I stood nearby, silently proud. Our plan had worked. Not through rage, not through vengeance, but through careful, deliberate action and the reclamation of dignity. Ethan faced the consequences, not in shaming, but in the discomfort of truth, in the eyes of people who respected her, in the mirror reflecting the husband who had for so long taken her for granted. He tried to apologize, fumbling over his words, awkward and sincere in the way that only genuine fear and self-realization can produce. And Lila, finally unburdened, accepted a hesitant, but meaningful, olive branch. The balance of power had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. For the first time in years, the house felt light. No longer heavy with small tensions and unspoken indignities, it was a place where she could breathe. Ethan's realization wasn't about punishment, it was about moral consequence, and the social acknowledgement of actions he had ignored for too long. And as I watched them navigate the uneasy, yet honest, steps toward reconciliation, I realized that true change often comes quietly, through observation, patience, and a refusal to tolerate injustice. The world noticed, the community noticed, and more importantly, she noticed her own worth again. The days that followed were quieter, but in a way that felt profound. Lila and I had shared a private understanding now, a bond forged not just in twinhood, but in survival and subtle victory. The tension that had weighed on her shoulders for years was slowly lifting, and I felt the same relief in my own chest. She came over the next morning, a nervous smile tugging at her lips. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Her eyes shone with something I hadn't seen in months, hope. You don't have to thank me, I said, squeezing her hand. You just needed someone to remind him what happens when you stop being invisible. And I couldn't stand by and watch anymore. She laughed softly, a sound that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. I can't believe you actually did it, me, her life, his ego, all of it. I shrugged, feeling a quiet pride. It wasn't about ego. It was about justice, about dignity. You deserve to live your life without fear of small cruelties piling up until they become unbearable. Now he knows that too. Over the next few weeks, things began to settle into a new rhythm. Ethan seemed genuinely reflective, cautious not to repeat the behavior that had caused so much strain. He listened more, deferred less, and even apologized when he realized he had slipped into old patterns. Lila's laughter returned to our conversations, lighter now, not burdened by the careful filters she had used to survive his control. Watching them together, I realized the true power of intervention. It wasn't about dramatic confrontations or public shaming. It was about patience, strategy, and love, the kind that refuses to ignore injustice. By stepping into her shoes, I had not only reclaimed her life, but I had also given her the courage to reclaim herself. I reflected on the subtle lessons this experience had taught me. Power, when abused, leaves marks that aren't always visible. Small acts of disregard can erode confidence and joy, and those quiet injustices accumulate silently over years. But awareness, combined with calm action, has the capacity to restore balance in ways that anger or vengeance never could. One evening, as the three of us sat together over a casual dinner, I noticed the small gestures that had changed: Ethan passing the salad without comment, Lila sharing her thoughts freely, the way the atmosphere felt lighter, almost tangible in its ease. The storm had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. I realized then that healing is rarely loud. It comes through moments of honesty, through acknowledgement of mistakes, and through the gentle rebuilding of trust. Lila and Ethan were not perfect, but for the first time, their relationship felt rooted in awareness rather than ignorance, in accountability rather than assumption. And for me, the quiet victories mattered most in the private spaces, watching my twin reclaim her life, seeing her stand taller, hearing her speak freely, laughing without fear. That was the reward. That was the healing. We had learned that intervention, even in the shadows, can create profound change. That sometimes, standing up for someone you love means walking into their world, seeing through their eyes, and acting with precision, patience, and love. And most importantly, I knew that Lila would never again feel the need to diminish herself to make someone else comfortable. That lesson, that strength, was something no one could ever take away. Sitting in my own living room that evening, a cup of tea warming my hands, I thought about the journey we had just endured. The quiet victories, the tense moments, the careful planning, it all felt surreal now that the storm had passed. Lila was finally herself again, lighter, unafraid, and unashamed of her own voice. And Ethan, well, he had learned lessons no amount of lectures could have taught. Accountability, once internalized, is far more powerful than punishment. I reflected on the strange intimacy of stepping into someone else's life. Feeling her fears, her frustrations, and her resilience made me understand her in a way nothing else ever could. It wasn't just about switching places, it was about empathy, protection, and the courage to act when love demanded it. Watching her smile freely again felt like reclaiming a piece of my own life too. Family dinners, quiet mornings, casual conversations, they now carried a weightless warmth that had been missing for years. The subtle gestures, the acknowledgement of effort, the kindness in small actions, it was remarkable how transformative those little things could be when someone finally saw you. I sometimes wonder, though, about the people who live with quiet suffering, who smile through bruises unseen. How many of them go unnoticed? How many never have a twin, a friend, or even a stranger brave enough to intervene? The power of compassion, when paired with courage, can be life-changing, but it requires noticing, understanding, and acting. And that's what I hope you take away from this story. Life doesn't always give us the dramatic, cinematic moments of justice we crave. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, almost invisible. But it works. It always works, when it comes from love, patience, and a refusal to accept injustice as normal. So I ask you, quietly, in the pause between breaths, would you notice if someone you love were quietly suffering? Would you act if it meant stepping into their world, feeling their pain, and giving them the strength to reclaim their life? Because sometimes, the smallest interventions leave the deepest marks, not on the people we confront, but on the people we save. And if this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of the quiet strength we can all find in protecting those we love, subscribe, share, and remember, courage is contagious, and compassion has consequences we often can't see, until it changes everything.